Triplets vanished without a trace in 1981, leaving behind nothing but questions and a mother's shattered heart. For 3 decades, she lived in the purgatory between hope and despair, clinging to the belief that somehow, somewhere, her children were still alive. Then one ordinary afternoon, a glimpse of something so familiar, yet impossible, sent her world spinning off its axis. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The South Texas sun beat down mercilessly as Evelyn Evie Marlowe made her way across the freshly mowed lawn. Her neighbor's grandson was turning 7 today, and the backyard buzzed with the chaotic energy of children playing tag and adults chatting over plastic cups of lemonade. For Evelyn, these social gatherings remained difficult even 30 years after her world had collapsed, but Walter had insisted she needed the distraction. "Evie, come have some cake," her neighbor called, waving her over with a paper plate. The woman's smile was kind but tinged with the familiar pity Evelyn had grown accustomed to seeing. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her story, the mother whose triplet sons vanished without a trace in the summer of 1981. The sweet scent of buttercream frosting mingled with freshly cut grass, transporting Evelyn back to another birthday. Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel had turned 5 just 2 weeks before they disappeared. She remembered how they'd blown out their candles in perfect unison, their identical faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The memory was so vivid it made her chest ache. "You doing all right?" Walter appeared beside her, his hand finding hers. His touch was frailer now, his recent health struggles evident in the tremor of his fingers. But his eyes held the same steadfast support they always had. "I'm fine," she assured him, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. She would never be completely fine again. Evelyn watched the children play, allowing herself a moment to imagine what her boys might look like now. Would they still have the same laugh? The same mannerisms? These thoughts followed her everywhere, shadowing her through the decades of searching and hoping. Then she saw him, a young boy darting through the crowd of children. He wore a red-striped t-shirt and denim overalls, his sneakers kicking up grass as he ran. Evelyn froze, her paper plate slipping from her fingers. "What is it?" Walter asked, alarmed by her sudden pallor. "That boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the party noise. "His clothes, they're exactly what the boys were wearing when they disappeared. The same red stripes, the same overalls." Walter squinted toward the children. "Evie, it's just a coincidence. Those are common clothes for kids." But Evelyn couldn't tear her eyes away. The outfit was identical, down to the particular shade of red and the brass buttons on the overalls. Details she'd described countless times to police officers, reporters, and search parties. Details that had haunted her dreams for 30 years. "It's not just similar, Walter. It's exact." Her heart raced as intuition, the sharp maternal instinct that had never dulled despite the weight of her grief, flared to life. "Something's not right. I need to find out who that child is." Before Walter could respond, Evelyn was already moving through the crowd, following the boy who had unknowingly reopened a wound that had never truly healed. Evelyn Marlowe's hands trembled as she pushed open her front door, the memory of the boy at the party haunting her every step. The weight of 3 decades of grief pressed down on her shoulders as she made her way to the hall closet, reaching for the highest shelf where time itself seemed preserved in cardboard. The faded box had yellowed at the corners, its lid warped from years of being opened and closed during countless nights of desperate searching. She carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where her 3 boys had once eaten breakfast, laughing and swapping cereal prizes. Walter was at his doctor's appointment. Perhaps it was better he wasn't here to witness this familiar ritual of heartache. "Just one more look," she whispered to herself, knowing she'd said those exact words hundreds of times before. The photographs inside were organized chronologically, a timeline of joy that ended abruptly in 1981. Evelyn's fingers found the last picture taken of Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel. three identical smiles beneath matching crew cuts, standing proudly in their backyard with toy trucks clutched in small hands. She studied their faces, memorized long ago, searching for something, anything she might have missed. The mother traced the outline of each boy with her fingertip, remembering how Noah always stood a little straighter than his brothers, how Lucas had that tiny scar above his eyebrow from falling off the swing, how Gabriel's smile always seemed the widest. Then her gaze drifted to the background of the image, past the white picket fence that bordered their property. There, partially visible at the edge of the frame, sat a Cadillac, cream-colored and gleaming in the Texas sun. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The vehicle was parked across the street, just visible enough to make out its distinctive grille and hood ornament. "That's not right," she muttered, her heart racing. Their street had been home to modest families with modest cars. No one owned a Cadillac. More importantly, she had no memory of seeing this automobile on that fateful day, yet here it was, captured in the final photograph before her world collapsed. Evelyn grabbed her reading glasses and a magnifying glass from Walter's desk drawer, leaning closer to the image. The car appeared to be idling, not parked, as if someone were waiting, watching. A chill ran down her spine as she realized this unknown presence had been there, unaccounted for in her memories, perhaps overlooked by investigators. For the first time in years, something new had emerged from the ashes of her grief. Not just another painful reminder, but a potential clue. Evelyn set the photograph aside with uncharacteristic care, her mind already racing with possibilities and questions that had waited 30 years to be asked. Evelyn Marlowe sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of yellowed phone directories and neighborhood association newsletters. The photograph of her boys lay before her, but her eyes kept returning to the Cadillac in the background, a detail she'd somehow missed for 3 decades. With trembling hands, she circled the vehicle's partial license plate, visible in the corner of the image. "I remember every car on our street," she whispered to herself. "This one doesn't belong." For hours, she cross-referenced vehicle registrations from 1981 with her meticulously kept address book. The search felt both desperate and methodical, a mother's determination fueled by that flicker of hope she'd never allowed to die. Walter brought her tea, his movements slower now with age and illness, but his eyes still reflected the same resolve as hers. "You should rest, Evie," he suggested gently. "I can't," she replied, not looking up from her notes. "Not when we might finally have something." Near midnight, Evelyn found it, a community newsletter mentioning faculty parking assignments at the boys' elementary school. The Cadillac's description matched a vehicle registered to Howard Fielding, the Triplets' 3rd-grade teacher. The discovery sent a chill through her body. Howard told everyone he moved to Arizona 2 months before the boys disappeared, she said, her voice barely audible. "But his car was on our street that day." Walter leaned closer, examining the photograph. "Maybe he came back to visit? Without telling anyone? Without stopping by the school to see former colleagues?" Evelyn shook her head. "And why would he be parked near our house?" She pulled out more records, piecing together a timeline that contradicted everything Howard had claimed. The teacher had made a show of his farewell party, accepting gifts from students, including Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel. He told tearful stories about his new life waiting in Arizona, promising to write to his favorite class. "He lied," Evelyn whispered, the weight of this revelation pressing against her chest. "He never left South Texas." The question burned in her mind. Why would a respected teacher fabricate his departure? What connection could exist between his deception and her missing sons? The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore. Walter placed his hand over hers. "We should take this to the police." "With what? A partial license plate from a 30-year-old photo?" She shook her head. "We need more." Evelyn stared at the photograph again, her mind racing with possibilities. Howard had always been kind to the Triplets, often commenting on their remarkable bond. She remembered how he'd seemed particularly affected by their disappearance, sending a heartfelt letter of condolence postmarked from Arizona. "I need to find Howard Fielding," she said with quiet determination. "Whatever happened to my boys, he knows something about it." Evelyn Marlowe spent days trying to track down Howard Fielding. Her fingers trembled as she dialed each potential number, only to be met with disconnected lines or strangers who had never heard of him. She scoured online directories, social media, and public records, but it was as if the former teacher had simply evaporated from existence. "It's like he deliberately disappeared," she told Walter one evening, frustration evident in her voice. Her husband squeezed her hand reassuringly, despite his own fatigue from recent health issues. "Maybe that's exactly what he did," Walter suggested, his eyes reflecting the same determination that had sustained them through 30 years of uncertainty. Evelyn refused to give up. She drove to the county records office, requesting any information about Howard's property transactions or tax filings. The clerk returned empty-handed. Next, she visited the school where he had taught her boys, but administration had no forwarding address, only confirmation that he had resigned abruptly, claiming to be moving out of state. "Something doesn't add up," she muttered to herself, remembering the Cadillac in the photograph. If Howard had truly left before the boys vanished, why was his vehicle on their street that day? With traditional avenues exhausted, Evelyn expanded her search. She spent hours at the local library, methodically combing through microfiche archives of regional newspapers. Her eyes burned from strain as she scrolled through community bulletins, charity announcements, and local news stories spanning 3 decades. On the 4th day of her research, a small article from 8 years prior caught her attention. It featured a brief mention of a philanthropic initiative called Haven for Hope, a farm established to provide shelter and education for young immigrants near the Texas-Mexico border. The founder's name leapt from the page. "Howard Fielding. I found you," Evelyn whispered, her heart racing as she printed the article. The piece described the farm as a sanctuary where displaced children could find stability and purpose through agricultural work and education. Back home, she searched for information about Haven for Hope online, discovering its website with carefully curated photos of sunlit fields and smiling children. The organization presented itself as a beacon of compassion in the harsh borderlands. Howard's face was notably absent from any images, though he was mentioned reverently as the visionary founder. Evelyn stared at the screen, a chill running through her despite the Texas heat. Something about the farm's isolated location and its focus on children without families stirred her maternal instincts in the most unsettling way. "Walter," she called, her voice steady with newfound purpose. "I think I know where we need to go next." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Evelyn laid out her findings on the kitchen table, spreading newspaper clippings and printed articles before Walter Marlowe. Her husband's once robust frame had thinned considerably in recent months, his medication bottles lined up like sentinels on the counter behind them. Despite his health challenges, Walter's eyes sharpened with interest as he examined the materials. "Haven for Hope," he read aloud, his finger tracing the headline. "And you're certain Howard Fielding founded this place?" "Everything points to it," Evelyn replied, showing him the charity's registration documents. "The timing lines up perfectly. Established just 3 years after our boys disappeared." Walter nodded slowly, his breathing slightly labored but his determination evident. "Then we need to see it for ourselves." They devised a simple plan. They would visit the farm posing as potential donors interested in supporting immigrant children. Evelyn rehearsed their cover story, while Walter researched typical questions philanthropists might ask. Despite his doctor's warnings about overexertion, nothing could dissuade him from accompanying his wife on this crucial mission. 2 days later, they drove 3 hours to the outskirts of a small border town. The farm sprawled across 30 acres of fertile land, its entrance marked by a hand-carved wooden sign. As they approached, Evelyn gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening with tension. Haven for Hope presented an idyllic picture: children tending vegetable gardens, staff members leading educational activities, and modern dormitories gleaming in the Texas sun. Their tour guide, a cheerful woman named Patricia, emphasized the organization's commitment to providing stability for displaced youngsters. Mr. Fielding believes every child deserves safety and purpose, Patricia explained, leading them through a communal dining area. He's transformed hundreds of lives over the years. While Walter engaged Patricia with questions about funding and operations, Evelyn's trained eye caught troubling details. A separate building stood behind an 8-foot fence, its windows tinted dark. When she casually inquired about it, Patricia's smile tightened. "Administrative offices," she answered curtly, "not part of our public tours." Throughout their visit, Evelyn noticed how staff members deflected questions about Howard's whereabouts. "Mr. Fielding is traveling." Or, "He's in meetings today," they'd say, their responses practiced and uniform. As they passed a bulletin board displaying the farm's history, Evelyn paused at a group photograph. Though partially obscured by other images, she could make out Howard standing proudly beside 3 teenage boys. "When might we meet Mr. Fielding?" Walter asked as their tour concluded. "We prefer knowing the leadership before committing funds." Patricia's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes hardened slightly. "I'll pass along your interest. He's very selective about his meetings." Driving away, Evelyn and Walter exchanged knowing glances. The farm's apparent benevolence couldn't mask the unsettling secrecy surrounding its founder, a secrecy that only deepened their suspicions. Evelyn shared her findings with Walter Marlowe, whose recent health struggles had left him frailer than before. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the newspaper clippings about Haven for Hope, but his eyes burned with determination. "We need to see this place for ourselves," Walter said, adjusting his reading glasses. "If there's even the slightest chance." They devised a simple plan. They would visit the farm, posing as potential donors, interested in supporting youth programs. The drive to the Texas-Mexico border took nearly 3 hours, with Evelyn gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Haven for Hope sprawled across 30 acres of cultivated land. From the outside, it appeared idyllic. Rows of vegetables stretching toward the horizon, modest buildings painted in warm earth tones, and young people working together in the fields. A sign at the entrance proclaimed its mission, providing shelter and purpose to displaced youth. A young woman greeted them at the main building, offering refreshments before their tour. "Mr. Fielding will be delighted to meet supporters," she said cheerfully. "He's always looking for community partners." As they walked through the grounds, Evelyn noted how meticulously organized everything was. Children and teenagers tended gardens, repaired equipment, and studied in outdoor classrooms. Yet something felt off. Certain buildings were cordoned off, marked with staff-only signs, and employees seemed to stiffen whenever the visitors' questions became too specific. "And who oversees the daily operations?" Walter asked casually. "That would be Ferdinand," their guide replied. "He coordinates all our programs. In fact, here he comes now." Evelyn's world tilted sideways as a young man approached them, 29 or 30 years old, with familiar hazel eyes and a distinctive gait she would recognize anywhere. Her breath caught in her throat. The way he moved, the slight tilt of his head as he spoke, it was like watching a ghost of her son Lucas, grown to adulthood. "Welcome to Haven for Hope," Ferdinand said, extending his hand. "I understand you're interested in our work." Evelyn struggled to maintain composure, her voice barely audible as she introduced herself and Walter. Ferdinand seemed oblivious to her distress, enthusiastically explaining the farm's mission. "My brother Diego manages our agricultural programs," he added proudly. "We were both brought here as children, orphans with nowhere else to go. Howard gave us purpose, a family." "Both of you were orphans?" Walter asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Ferdinand nodded. Many of us were. That's why this place matters so much. As the tour continued, Evelyn noticed how staff members hovered protectively whenever they approached certain areas. Howard's name was mentioned with reverence, almost fear, and Ferdinand, with every gesture and smile, unknowingly tore open wounds. Back at their motel room, Walter Marlowe carefully connected his camera to their laptop. His hands trembled slightly, a symptom of his condition that had worsened in recent months. But his determination remained steady. Evelyn sat beside him, her breath catching as the images loaded onto the screen. "There," she whispered, enlarging a photo of Ferdinand. The young man's smile, the slight tilt of his head, even the way he gestured with his hands as he explained the farm's mission, it all struck a painful chord of familiarity. Walter pulled up another image, this one capturing Diego examining crop yields with other workers. "The resemblance is uncanny," he admitted, his voice low and measured. "But Evie, we need to be certain." Evelyn reached for the worn shoebox she'd brought from home. Inside lay 3 decades of memories, birthday cards never received, school photos never taken, milestones never celebrated. With reverent hands, she withdrew a faded photograph of her triplets on their 5th birthday, the last picture taken before they vanished. She placed it beside the digital images. The boys' round cheeks and bright eyes seemed to echo across time in the men's faces. Ferdinand's dimple matched Lucas's exactly. Diego's serious expression mirrored Noah's thoughtful gaze. "It's them," she said, her voice breaking. "I know it's them." Walter squeezed her hand. "Your instincts have always been strong," he said. "But we need more than resemblance. Grief can make us see what we want to see." Doubt crept in as Evelyn studied the photos again. Was she manufacturing connections? Creating patterns from coincidence? 30 years of searching had led to countless disappointments, false leads, mistaken identities, hopes raised only to be crushed. "I understand your caution," she told her husband, "but something feels different this time." That night, sleep came fitfully. In her dreams, Evelyn stood in their old backyard, the Texas wind rustling through the pecan trees. 3 small voices called to her, not in fear, but in recognition. "Mom," they said, the word carried on the breeze. "We're here." She woke with tears streaming down her face, but also with renewed conviction. Walter was already awake, watching her with concern. "I'm not chasing ghosts," Evelyn said firmly. "Ferdinand and Diego are our boys, and if they're at that farm, Gabriel might be there too." Walter nodded slowly. "Then we keep going," he said. "We find the truth, whatever it is." Outside, the South Texas dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of hope. Evelyn knew she needed more concrete evidence before approaching authorities. Through casual conversations during her visits to Haven for Hope, she developed a rapport with Maria, a kind-hearted administrative assistant who had worked at the farm for over 5 years. Evelyn's genuine interest in the organization's work gradually earned Maria's trust. "I've been thinking about making a substantial donation," Evelyn mentioned one afternoon. "But I'd like to understand more about how you support these young men." Maria smiled warmly. "Of course, we keep detailed records of everyone who comes through our doors. Would you like to see some of our success stories?" This opening was exactly what Evelyn had hoped for. While reviewing files in Maria's office, she managed to access Ferdinand and Diego's records when the assistant stepped away to answer a phone call. Her hands trembled as she quickly photographed the documents with Walter's camera. Later that night, Evelyn and Walter pored over the images in their hotel room. The adoption papers claimed Ferdinand and Diego had been born in Monterrey, Mexico, to a mother who died in childbirth. Yet during their conversations at the farm, both young men had mentioned childhood memories of a beach in Veracruz, hundreds of miles from their supposed birthplace. "The dates don't match either," Walter pointed out, his voice weak but his mind still sharp. "According to these papers, they're 25, but Ferdinand told you he just turned 29. Exactly the age our boys would be now, Evelyn whispered, her heart racing. The next day, Evelyn returned to the farm under the pretense of seeing the art therapy program. Ferdinand proudly showed her around the studio, where residents created paintings as part of their healing process. "This one is mine," he said, pointing to a canvas in the corner. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The painting depicted a vintage Cadillac parked beneath a sprawling oak tree, identical to the one in her photograph from the day her sons disappeared. The distinctive crack in the trunk, the specific angle of the vehicle, even the dappled sunlight filtering through the branches matched perfectly. "It's beautiful," she managed to say. "What inspired this particular scene?" Ferdinand frowned slightly. "I'm not sure. It's just something that appears in my dreams sometimes. Howard says I have an active imagination." Evelyn nodded, fighting to keep her composure. How could Ferdinand possibly know this detail unless he had been there? Unless he was Lucas, her son, carrying fragments of that day buried deep in his subconscious? As she left the farm that afternoon, Evelyn clutched her purse containing the photographic evidence. The forged documents and Ferdinand's painting weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle 30 years in the making. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Evelyn Marlowe sensed the shift in atmosphere at Haven for Hope. The once welcoming staff now watched her with guarded expressions, conversations halting when she approached. Her persistent questions about Ferdinand and Diego had clearly raised alarms. While pretending to admire the farm's vegetable garden, she positioned herself near an open window of the main office. Howard Fielding's voice drifted out, tense and commanding. "I don't care what excuse you give him. Take Diego to the southern property until this blows over. That woman is asking too many questions." Her blood ran cold. The man she once trusted as her son's teacher was now actively hiding one of the young men she suspected might be her child. Evelyn ducked away before being spotted, her heart hammering against her ribs. That evening, she noticed a vehicle leaving the compound with Diego inside. The young man looked troubled as he glanced back at the main house, unaware of her watching from behind a storage shed. The next morning, Evelyn drove to the local police station, clutching her folder of evidence. Officer Ramirez listened patiently as she laid out her suspicions. The Cadillac in the old photograph, the forged adoption papers she'd glimpsed, Ferdinand's uncanny resemblance to her missing boys, and now Howard's suspicious behavior. "Mrs. Marlowe," the officer said gently, "I understand your pain, but this is a 30-year-old case. These men are adults with established identities." "But the papers are forged," she insisted. "I saw them myself." "Did you take these documents? Do you have copies?" he asked. She shook her head, frustration mounting. "I couldn't risk being caught." Officer Ramirez sighed. "Without physical evidence, we can't justify reopening the investigation. These men might simply be orphans as claimed, with paperwork irregularities due to their immigration status." "They're not immigrants," Evelyn said firmly. "They're my sons." "Ma'am, grief can sometimes make us see connections that aren't there." His tone was sympathetic but dismissive. "Unless you bring me concrete evidence, my hands are tied." Leaving the station, Evelyn felt the familiar weight of disbelief pressing down on her shoulders. For 30 years, she'd been told to move on, to accept that her boys were gone. But she knew what she'd seen. Ferdinand's mannerisms, Diego's smile, the painting of the Cadillac that couldn't be coincidence. As she started her car, determination hardened within her. The authorities might not believe her yet, but she wouldn't stop. If Howard was hiding Diego, it only confirmed her suspicions. She needed more than intuition now. She needed proof that would force everyone to see the truth she already knew in her heart. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Evelyn's efforts hit a wall as the management at Haven for Hope grew increasingly wary of her presence. During her third visit to the farm, she noticed staff members watching her movements more closely, and several areas that had previously been accessible were suddenly off-limits. While pretending to use the restroom, she overheard Howard Fielding's voice through a partially open office door. His words sent chills down her spine. "Take Diego away for a while," Howard instructed someone on the phone. "Just until this blows over. I don't like how that woman keeps asking questions." The directive confirmed her worst fears. Her inquiries had not gone unnoticed. With trembling hands, Evelyn gathered her belongings and left the property, her mind racing with possibilities and dread. The following morning, she drove to the local police station, clutching a folder containing her evidence: photographs of Ferdinand and Diego, copies of the suspicious employee records, and the original picture showing Howard's Cadillac near her home on the day of the disappearance. Detective Martinez listened patiently, but remained skeptical. "Mrs. Marlowe, I understand your conviction," he said gently. "But we need more than resemblances and coincidences to reopen a 30-year-old case. These men have established identities now, without physical evidence or testimony." Frustrated but undeterred, Evelyn reached out to Carla Winters, a journalist known for her investigative work with the South Texas Chronicle. Unlike the authorities, Carla saw potential in the story. "Charitable organizations leave paper trails," the reporter explained over coffee. "If there's something irregular about Haven for Hope, we'll find it." Over the next week, Carla dug into public records, while Evelyn compiled everything she knew about the farm. Their breakthrough came when they discovered the property contained nearly twice the square footage reported in tax filings. Satellite images revealed structures not included in any official documentation. "These buildings don't exist on paper," Carla said, pointing to blurry outlines on her laptop screen. "But they're clearly there. And look at these financial records, donations coming in from shell companies that lead nowhere." The journalist published a carefully worded article questioning the transparency of Haven for Hope's operations. Without directly accusing Howard of kidnapping, the piece highlighted the coincidental timing of the farm's founding shortly after the Marlowe triplets' disappearance. The story spread quickly through the community that had never forgotten the missing boys. Social media amplified the narrative, and within days, the sheriff's office was flooded with calls demanding action. "They're reopening the investigation," Walter told his wife, hanging up the phone with shaking hands. "They can't ignore us anymore." For the first time in decades, Evelyn felt something beyond hope. She felt vindication. Undeterred by the lack of official support, Evelyn Marlowe reached out to a local journalist who had previously covered cold cases in South Texas. The woman listened intently as Evelyn laid out her suspicions, spreading photographs across the reporter's cluttered desk. "I know how this sounds," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "But these men at Haven for Hope are my boys." The journalist, though skeptical at first, agreed to investigate the farm's charitable status. What began as a courtesy quickly evolved into serious research as she uncovered troubling inconsistencies. The organization's paperwork showed irregular financial patterns and vague documentation about its founding. More concerning were the building permits that hinted at unregistered living quarters hidden on the property. "These aren't just administrative oversights," the reporter explained to Evelyn and Walter during a hushed meeting at a local diner. "There's something deliberately obscured about this place." As the journalist published her initial findings, public interest in the Marlowe triplets case reignited. Old neighbors called with forgotten details, and community forums buzzed with speculation. The pressure on law enforcement mounted, though they remained frustratingly non-committal. 3 days later, Evelyn received an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a flyer for an upcoming agricultural fair, with 3 words scrawled across it: "They'll be there." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message unmistakable. "It could be a trap," Walter cautioned, his face pale with worry as he sat in his armchair. oxygen tank beside him, or someone's idea of a cruel joke. Evelyn studied her husband's weakened frame, knowing the strain this was putting on his heart. "I can go alone," she offered. "Not a chance," he replied, reaching for her hand. "We started this together 30 years ago. We'll see it through together." The fair bustled with activity when they arrived, the air thick with the scent of fried food and livestock. Walter leaned heavily on his cane as they navigated through the crowds, scanning faces with practiced precision. Near the Agricultural Awards Pavilion, Evelyn froze. There stood Howard Fielding, older but unmistakable, flanked by Ferdinand and Diego. The three men were examining a display of organic farming techniques, unaware of being watched. "That's them," she whispered, clutching Walter's arm. "All these years." With trembling fingers, Evelyn retrieved a worn photograph from her purse, the last image taken of her three smiling boys. She straightened her shoulders and moved forward, her heart thundering against her ribs. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the small space between them. "I believe we need to talk. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." The agricultural fair buzzed with activity as Evelyn and Walter Marlowe made their way through the crowded pavilions. Walter's breathing was labored, but determination kept him moving steadily beside his wife. They had waited 30 years for this moment, a chance confrontation that might finally answer the question that had haunted their every waking hour. "There," Evelyn whispered, her hand tightening around the worn photograph in her pocket. Howard Fielding stood near a display of organic produce, flanked by Ferdinand and Diego, the young men whose faces had triggered something primal in her mother's heart. Walter squeezed her hand. "Are you sure you want to do this here, with all these people?" "That's exactly why it needs to be here," she replied. "He can't just make us disappear." Gathering her courage, Evelyn approached the trio. Ferdinand noticed her first, his smile faltering as he recognized the persistent woman from the farm tour. Diego turned next, his expression guarded but curious. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to show you something." Before Howard could intervene, she withdrew the photograph. Three identical 5-year-old boys sitting on a porch swing, their matching overalls and gap-toothed smiles preserved in fading color. Her hands trembled as she held it out to Ferdinand and Diego. "Do you recognize these children?" she asked. The young men stared at the image, confusion evident in their expressions. Ferdinand reached for the photograph, his fingertips brushing against it hesitantly. "I don't understand," he said, but something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of recognition that he couldn't quite place. Diego leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "Where did you get this?" "These are my sons," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel. They disappeared from our backyard 30 years ago." A strange stillness came over Ferdinand. He touched his own face unconsciously, as if trying to reconcile the image with his reflection. Diego took a step back, visibly shaken. Howard suddenly pushed between them, his face contorted with anger and fear. "That's enough," he snapped, gripping each young man by the arm. "These people are disturbed. They've been harassing our organization." "But the picture," Ferdinand began, "is nothing to do with you," Howard interrupted, steering them away. He turned back to Evelyn, his voice low and threatening. "Leave my family alone. They are not your boys." As Howard pulled them through the crowd, both Ferdinand and Diego looked back at Evelyn, their eyes filled with questions they hadn't known to ask until this moment. Walter put his arm around his wife as they watched the trio disappear into the throng of fairgoers. "They recognize something," Evelyn whispered. "Did you see their faces?" "I did," Walter confirmed. And so did Howard. That's why he panicked. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and Evelyn knew they would grow. Back at Haven for Hope, Ferdinand paced across the wooden floorboards of the small cabin he shared with Diego. The woman's face, her eyes especially, had awakened something deep within him, something that felt both foreign and familiar. The photograph she'd thrust toward them had sent electric shocks through his system. "I can't stop thinking about it," Ferdinand confessed to his brother, who sat on the edge of his bed, equally disturbed. "That picture. Those boys looked exactly like us." Diego ran his fingers through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had for as long as either could remember. "Howard said she's just a troubled woman, that we shouldn't let her upset us." "But what if she isn't?" Ferdinand challenged. "What if there's truth to what she's saying? Haven't you ever wondered why we have no pictures from before we were 7? Why Howard gets so defensive whenever we ask about our birth parents?" The brothers fell silent, the weight of unspoken questions filling the space between them. Diego stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the farm that had been their entire world. "Remember that nightmare I used to have?" he asked quietly. "About being pulled away from someone. I always thought it was just a dream. But what if it's a memory?" Ferdinand nodded slowly. "And those birthmarks Howard always said were burn scars from the fire that killed our parents? They match exactly with the boys in that photo." Outside their cabin, Howard's voice carried across the property as he barked orders at the seasonal workers. His protective nature had always seemed like love. Now it felt suffocating. "He's been acting strange ever since that woman showed up at the fair," Diego observed. "Did you notice he locked the east wing again? Said it was for maintenance. But I saw him taking food there last night." Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Marlowe sat across from Detective Ramirez, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside lay 30 years of grief transformed into evidence. The photograph with Howard's Cadillac, employee records with falsified dates, Ferdinand's painting of the identical car, and Walter's recent photos of the brothers. "Mrs. Marlowe," the detective said carefully, "I understand your conviction, but reopening a case this old requires substantial evidence." "DNA would confirm everything," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But first, you need to search that property. There's something Howard doesn't want anyone to see in that east wing." The detective studied the documents, his professional skepticism gradually giving way to concern. "I'll request a warrant," he finally said. "But I need you to stay away from the farm. If there's any truth to this, Howard Fielding could be dangerous if cornered." As Evelyn left the police station, her phone buzzed with a text from Walter. "They're starting to remember." The dawn broke with flashing lights and urgent voices as police vehicles surrounded Haven for Hope. Officers in tactical gear approached the main building, while bewildered staff members were corralled into the communal dining area. Evelyn and Walter Marlowe watched from behind the police line, their faces etched with both hope and terror. "Search every room, every closet," ordered the lead detective, waving the warrant. "According to our informant, there may be hidden areas not on the official blueprints." The search progressed methodically through the farm's main buildings. Ferdinand and Diego were kept separate from other staff, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. The brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Their world was unraveling before their eyes. 3 hours into the search, an officer discovered an anomaly in the East Wing's construction. "The dimensions don't match up," he called out. "There's space unaccounted for behind this wall." When they broke through the false wall, they found a narrow corridor leading to a separate living space, a hidden apartment completely isolated from the rest of the facility. Inside, hunched in a corner, they found a young man who physically resembled Ferdinand and Diego, but whose eyes held a haunted vacancy that spoke of years of isolation. "Gabriel," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking as she was finally permitted to approach. The authorities had initially tried to keep her back, but her insistence prevailed. "My baby." The young man, known as Marco to the few who knew of his existence, recoiled from the officers and social workers who attempted to approach him. His movements were jerky, his speech halting and uncertain. Years of limited human contact had left visible marks on his development. Yet when Evelyn slowly approached, something flickered in his eyes. Not recognition exactly, But something primal, a connection that transcended the 30 years of separation. He's been kept here all this time, the detective explained quietly to Walter, whose health concerns temporarily forgotten in the shock of the moment. Preliminary assessment suggests severe social isolation. We've called in specialists. As evidence was collected from the hidden quarters, journals, medication, sparse personal effects, the full horror of the situation began to emerge. While Ferdinand and Diego had been raised as Howard's public success stories, Gabriel had been hidden away, deemed too unstable or damaged for the public narrative Howard had crafted. Evelyn reached out her hand, not touching Gabriel but offering connection. After several tense moments, he extended his fingers toward hers, not quite touching, but acknowledging her presence in a way he'd refused with others. It was the first fragile thread in what would be a long, painful journey toward healing. The raid on Haven for Hope unfolded with military precision at dawn. Law enforcement officers swarmed the property, their vehicles creating dust clouds visible from miles away. Evelyn and Walter Marlowe waited anxiously beyond the perimeter, their hearts pounding with equal measures of hope and dread. As officers methodically searched the main buildings, a detective discovered an anomaly in the farm's blueprints, a wing that appeared on original plans but had been deliberately omitted from more recent documents. Behind a false wall in Howard's office, they found a hidden corridor leading to an isolated section of the compound. "We found something," crackled the radio. "There's someone here." In a sparsely furnished room, authorities discovered Gabriel Marlowe, the third brother, living in complete isolation. Unlike Ferdinand and Diego, who had been integrated into the farm's operations, Gabriel appeared withdrawn and fearful. When officers approached, he retreated to a corner, eyes wide with distrust. "He's been kept separate from the others," explained the lead investigator to Evelyn. "We believe Howard isolated him because he retained more memories of his true identity than the others." When Evelyn was finally permitted to see him, she approached with trembling steps. The young man before her was a stranger, yet unmistakably her son, his features mirroring those of his brothers, though marked by years of solitude. "Gabriel," she whispered, the name foreign to his ears. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or the ghost of a memory long suppressed. He didn't speak, but he didn't turn away either. News helicopters circled overhead as the brothers were escorted from the property. Media outlets broadcast the unfolding drama nationwide, headlines screaming about the miracle in Texas and the mother who never gave up. Public outrage mounted as details emerged about Howard's elaborate deception. DNA samples were collected from all three brothers and rushed to a laboratory. Within days, the results confirmed what Evelyn had known in her heart. Ferdinand, Diego, and Gabriel were indeed Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel Marlowe, her triplets, stolen 30 years earlier. Howard Fielding was arrested at the scene, charged with kidnapping, falsification of records, and child endangerment. During interrogation, the truth finally surfaced. After losing his own children in a house fire, Howard's grief had twisted into obsession. He'd targeted the Marlowe triplets specifically, planning their abduction for months. "I gave them a good life," he insisted during questioning. "They were loved. They were safe." But the psychological evaluation painted a different picture. A broken man who had stolen 3 lives to fill the void in his own. As Howard was led away in handcuffs, Evelyn watched not with hatred, but with the quiet certainty that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. The media storm erupted like wildfire across South Texas as news helicopters circled over Haven for Hope. Reporters jostled for position outside the farm's gates, their cameras capturing the moment Evelyn Marlowe emerged with 3 men. Her sons, found after 3 decades of agonizing absence. The DNA results confirmed what Evelyn had known in her heart. Ferdinand, Diego, and Marco were indeed Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel Marlowe. Blood samples taken from all 3 brothers matched perfectly with their parents, creating an irrefutable scientific link that turned a mother's desperate theory into undeniable fact. Howard Fielding was led away in handcuffs, his face hidden beneath a jacket as authorities escorted him to a waiting police vehicle. The charges mounted quickly. 3 counts of kidnapping, falsification of government records, identity fraud, and psychological abuse. Investigators discovered that after losing his own children in a house fire, Howard's grief had twisted into obsession, leading him to rebuild his family by stealing someone else's. "I gave them a good life," Howard shouted to reporters. "I loved them when no one else would." His words echoed across the farm property, causing Lucas to flinch visibly as he stood beside his biological mother. Inside the Marlowe home, reunion gave way to reality. The brothers sat awkwardly in the living room, strangers to the space that should have been their childhood home. Noah stared at family photos on the wall, seeing versions of himself that memory couldn't reconcile. Gabriel remained the most withdrawn, flinching at sudden movements and speaking only in whispers. "We built a life there," Lucas said, his voice breaking as he addressed Evelyn. "How do we just forget that?" Walter Marlowe, weakened by heart problems but determined to know his sons, reached across the table with trembling hands. "We're not asking you to forget," the elderly man said, "just to make room for what was taken from all of us." The brothers' confusion manifested in different ways. Noah paced constantly, his farmer's instincts making him restless in suburban confinement. Gabriel would disappear for hours, eventually found hiding in closets or the basement. Lucas, the most adaptable, tried desperately to bridge both worlds, but often broke down when alone. Counselors warned Evelyn about the complexity of trauma bonding, explaining how the brothers might defend Howard despite understanding his crimes. "They've known him as their father for 30 years, one therapist explained. "That identity can't be erased overnight." Each night, Evelyn would sit beside Walter's bed, holding his hand as his breathing grew more labored. "We need to make every moment count," she whispered. "They're home, Walter. Our boys are finally home." But home, they were learning, was a concept far more complicated than 4 walls and shared DNA. It was a journey they were only beginning to navigate, together, yet still worlds apart. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The reunion that Evelyn Marlowe had dreamed of for 30 years unfolded with layers of complexity no one had anticipated. What should have been purely joyous instead became a delicate dance of trauma, confusion, and tentative hope. The DNA results confirmed what her heart had known, but science couldn't bridge 3 decades of separation. Lucas, formerly known as Ferdinand, sat alone on the porch of the farmhouse, staring at the fields he had tended for years. The young man traced his fingers along the weathered wood railing, wrestling with the knowledge that everything he believed about himself was built on deception. The farm, once his future and legacy, now represented a monument to Howard's crimes. "I don't know who I am anymore," he confessed to Evelyn when she brought him coffee one morning. "Everything I planned to do with this place, it feels wrong now." Inside the house, Noah struggled with different demons. The middle brother paced between loyalty to the only father figure he remembered and the biological family he was told to forget. He kept Howard's photo hidden in his wallet, unable to fully vilify the man who had raised him, despite understanding the horrific nature of what he'd done. "He wasn't always cruel," Noah whispered during a family dinner that had fallen into uncomfortable silence. "I know what he did was unforgivable, but—" The words hung in the air, met with Walter's pained expression. The elderly man's health continued to deteriorate, adding urgency to their attempts at reconciliation. Each labored breath reminded them all that time was precious. Gabriel remained the most distant of the 3. Having spent years isolated in the hidden wing of the property, his trauma ran deepest. He flinched at sudden movements and rarely spoke above a whisper. The professional counselors brought in to assist the family found his case particularly challenging. Gabriel, needs more specialized care, the lead therapist explained during a session in the Marlowe living room. His confinement created unique psychological barriers. The brothers' progress moved in uneven waves, moments of breakthrough followed by days of retreat. Lucas began remembering fragments of his early childhood, the scent of Evelyn's perfume, the sound of Walter's laugh. Noah found himself drawn to old family albums, studying photos of birthdays he couldn't recall celebrating. Gabriel simply watched, his eyes revealing flickers of recognition that his voice couldn't yet express. For Evelyn, each small step forward was precious. When Lucas unconsciously hummed a lullaby she used to sing, one Howard couldn't have taught him, tears streamed down her face. It was in these tiny moments that healing began, fragile threads connecting what was lost to what might still be salvaged. Walter held her hand tightly during these breakthroughs, his weakening grip a reminder that their reunited family existed in the shadow of time's relentless march forward. The news of Howard Fielding's arrest and the discovery of the Marlowe triplets spread through the South Texas community like wildfire. Some neighbors organized meal trains and support groups for the reunited family, while others kept their distance, uncomfortable with the disturbing reality that had been unearthed in their midst. Lucas, formerly known as Ferdinand, sat alone in the farm's main office, surrounded by paperwork and uncertainty. The weight of Haven for Hope's future rested heavily on his shoulders. The charitable organization that had sheltered dozens of young immigrants now stood tainted by its founders' crimes. Lucas stared at the farm's financial records, his hands trembling slightly as he contemplated what would happen to the children who had found refuge here. "We can still make this work," Noah said, entering the room. The middle brother, who had lived his life as Diego, had always been the practical one. "The farm doesn't have to die with Howard's lies." Lucas looked up at his brother. "How can we separate what's good here from what he did to us?" Meanwhile, Gabriel remained the most withdrawn of the three. Having spent years isolated in the hidden wing of the property, he struggled to connect with his biological family or even his brothers. The psychologist, who visited 3 times weekly, noted that Marco, as he still preferred to be called, exhibited classic signs of prolonged trauma and institutionalization. At the Marlowe residence, Evelyn fielded phone calls from well-wishers and media outlets alike. Walter, despite his declining health, had become her steadfast shield against the more intrusive inquiries. Some longtime neighbors questioned whether Evelyn's decades-long obsession had been worth the pain it caused. "You should have let those boys be," Mrs. Hernandez from 2 doors down had whispered at the grocery store. "They had a life. Now what do they have?" The question haunted Evelyn as she watched her sons struggle with their fractured identities. The truth had not brought the healing she had imagined during those 30 years of searching. Instead, it had created new wounds that needed tending. The farm itself stood in limbo, its operations temporarily managed by state authorities while investigations continued. Several children who had been living there were placed with foster families or relocated to other facilities. The triplets found themselves homeless in a sense, unable to return to the only home they remembered, yet strangers in the house where they were born. Noah summed it up one evening as the brothers sat together on the porch of their childhood home. "We're caught between 2 lives, neither of which feels completely real anymore." The reaction from the community of South Texas split like a fracture through stone. Some neighbors rallied around the Marlowe family with casseroles, prayer circles, and handwritten cards, gestures that felt both touching and strangely inadequate against the magnitude of what had happened. Others kept their distance, whispering behind cupped hands about Evelyn's 3-decade obsession and the scandal that had upended their quiet corner of the world. "Some folks think I should have let sleeping dogs lie," Evelyn Marlowe confessed to the documentary crew, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "They say those boys had a life, however it came about. But no mother could ever stop searching, not when her heart knows her children are out there. Walter's health continued to decline, adding urgency to the family's attempts at reconnection. Despite his weakening body, his spirit remained resolute. "I may not have much time," he told the triplets during a Sunday dinner, "but I've got enough to know my sons." The closure of Haven for Hope sent ripples through the border community. Investigators discovered 3 other children living there under questionable circumstances, all now reunited with their biological families. Yet for Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, the farm's shutdown strips away the only stable environment they had known for 30 years. The fields where Diego had worked, the art studio where Ferdinand had painted, the quiet corner where Marco had found solace, all now evidence in a criminal case. "I feel homeless in 2 worlds," Lucas admitted during a therapy session filmed with his permission. "I'm Ferdinand when I close my eyes at night. But I'm also this person called Lucas who has a mother who never stopped looking." Some community members organized a fund to help the brothers transition, while others questioned whether Howard's intentions, however misguided, deserved such harsh punishment. "He gave those boys education, purpose, shelter," argued one longtime supporter of the farm. "What he did was wrong, but was it evil?" Evelyn faced these criticisms with newfound strength. The woman who had once moved quietly through the world now spoke at community meetings and parent support groups. "Justice isn't just about punishment," she explained. "It's about truth. My boys deserve to know who they really are." As the legal proceedings against Howard Fielding continued, the family navigated their new reality one day at a time. Some days brought breakthroughs, Gabriel allowing Evelyn to touch his shoulder, Noah asking about his childhood before the abduction. Other days brought setbacks, angry outbursts, confusion, and the painful realization that 30 years could never be reclaimed. Yet beneath the complexity, a simple truth emerged. A family, fractured but finally whole, was finding its way forward together.